In the mansion lit by golden chandeliers, where luxury was merely a facade to hide dark secrets, Emily, the young blonde maid in a simple but impeccable uniform, served the table with the same dedication as ever. Her mistress, elegant in a provocative red dress, observed every gesture coldly, while the millionaire Alexander, distracted, chatted with guests. But behind her wife's smile lay a poisonous plan. With subtle movements, she dropped a pill into Emily's teacup. The steaming liquid seemed harmless, but it held the promise of silence and forced obedience. Emily, however, sensed danger. Her mistress's quick glance, harder than the crystal of the glasses, confirmed her suspicions. As she lifted the tea to her lips, she made a risky decision. She would pretend to fall into the trap to uncover the hidden truth that lurked within the house. Minutes later, Emily slumped against the table, as if all strength had left her. Her uniform was crumpled, her eyes half-lidded, her body inert. She was the perfect image of a helpless victim. Her employer smiled cruelly, believing she had won, and motioned for the men present to continue their conversation. What Alexander didn't realize, and the guests even less so, was that Emily, behind her heavy eyelids, was listening to every word. Her racing heart beat like a war drum as she registered the cruel plan unfolding before her. Feigning sleep, she absorbed every detail, aware that this act might be her only chance to turn the tables. What her employer didn't know was that, by trying to silence her maid, she had just planted the seed of her own downfall. Stories like this show how fate acts silently. Before continuing, leave a like and subscribe, because the most intense part is yet to begin. Night fell over the mansion like a heavy velvet curtain, covering the gardens illuminated by rows of golden lights. Inside, crystal chandeliers cast reflections across the hall, creating an atmosphere as elegant as it was stifling. Emily, the young blonde maid in a short, impeccable uniform, moved silently, serving glasses and clearing plates with the same discipline she had learned since adolescence. Her erect posture, even in the face of gazes that treated her as invisible, hid a heart weary of enduring silent humiliation. Her employer, dressed in a provocative red dress with a plunging neckline and a hem above the knees, watched her every move with sharp eyes, as if searching for the slightest error to turn into a spectacle. Alexander, the millionaire, seated beside his wife, seemed oblivious to the tension permeating the air, but deep inside there was something she could no longer disguise. The mistress smiled, greeting guests, but within her a plan was being born and strengthened. For weeks she had noticed her husband's eyes straying, even if only briefly, to the maid. Emily had never given reasons, never overstepped her bounds of duty, but the mistress needed no proof. Intuition and the fear of losing her power were enough. And that night, she had decided to silence the maid once and for all. With subtle movements, hidden behind the gestures of a perfect hostess, she dropped a colorless pill into the cup Emily was supposed to drink. The hot, steaming tea seemed harmless on the porcelain table. Only the mistress's eyes, fixed and icy, betrayed the cruelty hidden within that drink. Emily noticed the strange look and hesitated. Her intuition, honed by years of surviving in silence, triggered a warning within her. Approaching the cup, she lifted it delicately but without immediately bringing the liquid to her lips. Her boss, attentive, raised her eyebrows as if demanding an unspoken order. Emily understood there was no escape. Pretending would be her only weapon. She brought the tea to her mouth, pressed her lips to the rim of the porcelain, and pretended to swallow, while discreetly letting the liquid drip back into the cup. After a few minutes, she touched her forehead as if dizzy and slowly slid down onto the table. The rumpled uniform, the hair falling over his face, the seemingly weak body, everything indicated the trap had worked. The guests looked on curiously. Some chuckled quietly, others feigned concern. The mistress, with a cruel smile hidden behind her champagne flute, believed she had won. Alexander stood up, confused, but was restrained by his wife, who said in a sweet, measured tone, "She just couldn't control herself. She must be tired." The room returned to a murmur as if nothing had happened. But Emily, behind her half-closed eyelids, wasn't unconscious. Every word spoken at the table now reached her ears with piercing clarity. Her racing heart betrayed the risk, but her mind was alert, registering every phrase. Pretending to be unconscious, she heard voices, heard plans, heard truths she had never imagined. And in that forced silence, she discovered that her mistress's cruelty was only the tip of something much larger. That night, the maid, everyone believed defeated, had actually taken the first step toward unmasking the woman who was making her life a torment. Fate was already in motion, and what seemed like defeat was only the beginning of the greatest of twists and turns. The antique clock ticked away like drops on a cave ceiling, each tick seeming to widen the gap between what was seen and what was being plotted. Emily, motionless on the side table, let her weight fall as if in surrender, her breathing adjusting to a shallow, believable rhythm. The linen tablecloth brushed her wet face, and the scent of sweet tea mixed with her mistress's expensive perfume rose to her nostrils like a warning. A few steps away, chairs scraped against the marble, and voices approached, first in whispers, then in a tone too practical for those feigning compassion. "No hospital. That'll go away soon," said the wife, sweet as poison. "Tomorrow, she'll be returning to the city with the letter of recommendation. Adequate." A short laugh cut the air. The banker, a guest intimate by appearances, wanted to know if the girl understands safes. The boss replied that she will understand if necessary, and the word echoed like a sentence. They would plant the idea of theft, replace a piece from the collection, call security, and that was it. A problematic employee, a scandal contained, morale preserved. Emily resisted the urge to lift her head. Her heart leaped when she heard her full name, pronounced with bureaucratic coldness, followed by dates, times, and the mention of a spare key that will be conveniently kept poorly guarded. She mentally noted every detail: the tapestry corridor, the display case with the rare pearl necklace, the window overlooking the inner courtyard. Nobody passes by at dawn. A glass landed near her hand, and the ice crackled. Alexander stood there, silent, as if nodding with his eyes closed. But his voice came low, cracked. "That's an exaggeration." Her employer smiled without looking. "Exaggeration, that's what the newspapers say. Here we settle things in-house." The banker murmured about avoiding rumors. The columnist, invited by accident, which is never an accident, said that empty stories don't pay off. The entire plan fit into 3 lines: demoralize, expel, forget. In the fabric of silence, Emily noticed another texture: footsteps receding, footsteps returning, the rustling of an envelope. "Marta will sign the resignation tomorrow morning. Tonight, we'll check the collection," her employer decreed, cutting the air with a jingle of bracelets. The mention of the former housekeeper lit a spark of hope in her. Marta was the eyes of the house, the memory of everything. If there was a rope to grasp, it was there. And there was more. The new, diligent security guard had replaced the hallway cameras the week before. Emily remembered the ladder, the new cable, the fine dust on the sensor. Her employer had counted on shadows. The shadows were now recording. The room resumed a semblance of normalcy. The piano slowly returned, the clink of silverware covered broken phrases, and the scent of jasmine erased traces like a careful eraser. Emily chose the moment to wake up. A deep sigh, her hand groping for the edge of the table, her eyes opening with measured slowness. She heard the false relief in the "oh, thank God," and felt her employer's hand on her shoulder with the lightness of someone heavy. It was just a feeling of discomfort. She nodded obediently and excused herself to go to the pantry for a drink of water. No one stopped her. Danger believes its own disguise. In the hallway, the gloom brought her back to focus. She rinsed her face in the stone sink, pressed the cloth to her temples, and in the wet sheen of the metal saw her own decision take shape. She wouldn't rush. She would gather evidence. She would speak to Marta before dawn. She would check the drawer where they kept the keys, pass by the paintings in the east, count pearls on her fingers. The patience she had learned rubbing silver would now serve to polish the truth, until it reflected enough to blind those who lived by theatrics. Returning to the drawing room, she passed Alexander in the doorway. He opened his mouth, found no words, and she pierced him with a look that said more than a request. Look. Dawn fell heavily. The house fell asleep on different floors. Downstairs, the clock persisted in its work. Before the first bird chimed, Emily went down to the pantry and found Marta folding napkins with the devotion of someone saving ships. She whispered what she had heard. The housekeeper, with worn eyes and a firm pulse, nodded without alarm. She had requested the new cameras precisely because she was suspicious of the recent accidents. The hallway records continuously, he said, as he pulled an old keychain from his pocket. And I keep a copy of the signed inventory with me. Emily felt the tide return to her chest. They aligned. Their steps, at 6, checking the display window, at 7, backing up the recordings, at 8, Alexander, in suits, not in fear. At the top of the stairs, the red glow of her mistress's dress crossed like an omen. Her plan was on. Theirs too. The sun hadn't even fully risen when Emily, with a firm heart, began to execute the silent plan she'd agreed upon with Marta. The hallway was empty, the carpets cushioned every step, and the only sound was the ticking of the antique clock on the wall. Marta opened the silverware storage room door with her own key and showed Emily the folder of signed inventories. Every piece of jewelry catalogued, every number checked. They're going to try to tamper with this, he whispered, handing the young woman the stamped sheets. Emily tucked them under her uniform like a shield. That morning, the boss came downstairs looking radiant for someone who'd barely slept. Her light dress hid the tension in her shoulders, but her stiff smile betrayed that she was about to pounce. With an air of feigned distraction, she left an expensive earring on the kitchen table, and minutes later, feigned concern. Has someone gone through my things? The previous night's guests had already left, but the columnist, curious and insatiable, had returned early for coffee. All the boss wanted, an audience. Emily, however, had already anticipated the commotion. She walked to the display room and, along with Marta, checked the inventory before any accusations were made. The cameras, now working, recorded every move. When she returned, she found her boss in the middle of a scene, standing, pointing to the empty space on the table, swearing the earring was gone. The columnist's eyes shone with anticipation, and Alexander, his suit still disheveled, entered the room, drawn by the commotion. This again? He asked wearily. His boss quickly retorted, It's not an invention, it's theft, and gave Emily a venomous look. The young woman felt the floor freeze, but she didn't flinch. She slowly removed the folder of signed inventories from her apron and placed it on the table. Here's proof that nothing was touched. Everything is recorded. Marta nodded firmly. The columnist leaned in curiously, and Alexander reached out, opening the pages. He read silently, his eyes moving between the numbers and signatures, and a shadow of doubt began to fade from his face. It was at that moment that the security guard hurried in, carrying a tablet. Sir, the cameras recorded strange movements in the early hours of the morning. In the video, everyone could see the boss silently crossing the hallway, holding something small in her hand. It wasn't explicit, but enough to elicit murmurs. The columnist gave a wry smile, already forming the headline in her head. Alexander, silent, closed the inventory, looked at his wife, and for the first time, didn't look away. The mistress tried to hide it, laughing nervously, saying she was just checking her jewelry. But her forced tone of voice was unmistakable. Emily remained silent, not celebrating, just breathing deeply, feeling that fate was beginning to lean in her favor. The mansion, which had so often been the scene of her humiliation, now witnessed another scene, the mistress's mask beginning to crack before everyone's eyes. Alexander, still torn, said nothing, but in the back of his mind, a certainty grew. Perhaps he had ignored the truth for too long, and if he didn't act soon, the downfall wouldn't just be his wife's, it would be his as well. The mistress could no longer bear to see the doubt growing in Alexander's eyes. His every silence was like a slap to her vanity. After the inventory episode, she locked herself in her room and spent hours in front of the mirror, trying to straighten her smile. as if she could sew back together the mask that fate had already torn. When she came downstairs, she was wearing another, even more striking red dress, her heels clicking on the marble like gunshots. She had decided that if respect wouldn't come through reason, it would come through force, and the one who would pay for it would be Emily. That evening, he gathered some close friends again, under the pretense of an informal dinner. Emily once again was summoned to serve, and from the first moment she noticed her employer's cold gaze, full of plans. The guests arrived tense, aware of the rumors already circulating in society. The laughter was forced, and eyes averted each time Emily entered the room. The employer, however, had no intention of hiding her intentions. She would turn the evening into a courtroom, and the maid would be both defendant and victim. During dinner, he deliberately dropped a silver knife at Emily's feet. "See if you can even hold this without damaging it," he said loudly, drawing everyone's attention. Emily bent down with dignity, picked up the utensil, and returned it without a word. The silence that followed was punctuated by a nervous laugh from one of the guests, but it quickly subsided. The embarrassment was no longer with the maid. It was with her own employer. Alexander, silent until then, looked up from his wineglass and stared at his wife. There was no anger on his face, only disappointment. Emily noticed and looked away, trying to hide the ache in her heart. It was too dangerous to be seen as a source of discord, but she could no longer control the course of events. The mistress, feeling her control slipping, decided to deliver the final blow. She called Emily to the front of everyone and, in a soft but razor-sharp voice, said, "Show these gentlemen the obedience I expect from those who live under this roof." She ordered her to kneel and pick up a non-existent stain on the carpet. The room held its breath. Emily hesitated, but before she could move, Alexander stood abruptly. "Enough," he said, his voice echoing through the hall. There was absolute silence. He walked over to Emily, grabbed her arm and pulled her to her, feet looking directly at his wife. "You've turned this house into a stage for your cruelty. It's over." His mistress opened her mouth, but no words came out. The guests, shocked, watched as the mask crumbled completely. Emily, beside him, didn't know whether to feel protected or to fear even more what would come next. Her heart was pounding, and for the first time she realized that the war wasn't just hers. Alexander himself was caught in the crossfire, and deep within the mansion, where the walls seemed to hold memories, something invisible whispered that justice was already on the march, and nothing could stop it. The rumors didn't stay within the mansion. Within 2 days they were already circulating in the society pages, at dinners for bankers' wives, and in the corridors of companies that did business with Alexander. The story was clear and cruel. The boss, once a symbol of elegance, was being seen as an out-of-control woman, capable of turning a sophisticated dinner into a stage for humiliation. The words scandal and exposure began to stick to her name like indelible labels. With each new comment, more doors closed. Guests who had previously vied for the mansion's table now made excuses not to attend. Invitations were ignored, appointments cancelled. Alexander, when answering calls, heard short, evasive phrases. The partners' automatic smiles had disappeared, and all of this fell upon his wife like a mirror reflecting her cruelty. Emily watched from afar, but not with pleasure. It was impossible to erase from memory every humiliation she had suffered, every venomous word hurled her way. However, seeing her mistress stumble before her own pride, she understood that fate was merely returning what belonged to her. She remained steadfast in her duties, as if she were just another maid doing her job. But everyone in the house already knew there was something different about her, a silent strength, impossible to break. Alexander was also beginning to see clearly. At recent social gatherings, he noticed the sidelong glances, the way they whispered whenever his wife passed. And at the same time, he realized that Emily, even after everything, sought neither revenge nor glory. She simply stood her ground, held her head high and let time do its work. This struck him deeply, for her dignity contrasted with the desperation of the woman who had always believed herself untouchable. The boss, however, refused to accept defeat. She tried to turn things around, buying even more expensive clothes, smiling louder, and even daring to laugh at her own rumors as if they were malicious jokes invented by envious people. But with each gesture, the emptiness around her grew. The employees respected her only out of obligation. Close friends, one by one, drifted away, and Emily, without moving a single piece, became the invisible center of the narrative, not as the chosen protagonist, but as living proof that no one escapes karma. That night, Emily went downstairs to gather wilted flowers from the drawing room. When she looked up, she found Alexander watching her from upstairs. He said nothing, but his look was different. It wasn't one of desire nor guilt. It was one of recognition. Recognition that amidst the chaos, only she had remained true. Deep down, everyone already knew. The humiliation their boss had tried to turn into a sentence had become their own condemnation. And fate, with its silent precision, was preparing the final and most painful twist. The night of the final showdown arrived without invitations, without columnists and without bankers. There was no longer an audience, only the walls of the mansion that held memories of all the humiliations already staged there. The mistress descended the stairs dressed in red, as if she could still feign power. But there was no longer any sparkle in her eyes, only the dull reflection of someone who realized too late that respect cannot be bought, and fear cannot sustain forever. Alexander was waiting for her in the main room, standing, papers in hand, inventories, recordings, testimonies. Marta stood beside her, and behind her, Emily, impeccably uniformed and with the erect posture of someone who no longer needed to hide. The evidence was presented one by one. The cameras showed the boss walking through hallways at night, opening locker room doors, handling objects she would later accuse Emily of stealing. The inventories signed by Marta confirmed that nothing had been touched. Even the columnist who had already spread rumors had let slip in her last note that inside sources confirmed the act. The circle was complete. The boss tried to defend herself with vague statements, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, but with each word her voice sounded more fragile, more powerless. Alexander, who had been torn for so long, finally spoke firmly. "Enough. This house will no longer be the scene of cruelty." His voice echoed through the hall like a sentence. Emily remained silent, but her eyes filled with unshed tears. They weren't tears of victory or pride, they were tears of relief. For the first time, someone was saying aloud what she had always known silently. The end of this oppression had come. The mistress, wounded in her vanity, ascended the stairs for the last time as lady of the house, but when the bedroom door closed behind her, there was no more kingdom, only walls that returned the empty echo of her defeat. The mansion, once laden with luxury and arrogance, now seemed lighter, as if it had lifted an ancient weight. Emily, however, didn't celebrate. She just continued working, collecting glasses, adjusting tablecloths, maintaining order. But her demeanor had changed. She was no longer the invisible maid, the target of humiliation. She was the woman who had faced the silence and survived. Alexander watched her with a mixture of respect and regret, aware that he had taken too long to open his eyes. That night, as she turned out, the chandeliers, Emily walked to the center of the room. There, where she had been mocked so many times, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She felt that finally karma had done its job. She didn't need revenge, no shouting, no harsh words. She simply stood firm, and life took care of revealing the truth. Fate, patiently, gave back to each what they deserved. To the mistress, loneliness. To Alexander, the bitter lesson of hesitation. And to Emily, the dignity that had always been hers, but which no one could now deny. If this story spoke to you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel and comment, "Fate always takes its toll."